Hi friends, I'm Joy and this is World Maker Books. We are back to finish up the reading of Black and White by Mark Wandrey. Today we'll have chapters 14 through 16 and the epilogue. Chapter 14, Karamon Base, Planet Hoarfrost, Upasha System, Koro Region, Tolo Arm, May 14th, 2038. Terry woke up and yawned. The ever-present low level of illumination in the Karamon Base wasn't enough to make sleeping difficult. There'd always been more light on the Teddy Roosevelt than he had to deal with now. When his friends arrived, they'd spent a couple of hours walking around and gawking at the structures. Everyone had been amazed that Terry had figured out how to get into the buildings. Then he explained he'd done so by accident, and they'd enjoyed a good laugh. "Do you think this is what the Selroth are looking for?" Taiki asked. "I was thinking the same thing," Terry said. "The answer is, I don't know." They still hadn't explored all the buildings when they needed to go back and check on the kids and adults. It was a good thing they had, because when they got there, some of the middle school-age kids were arguing with the adult women about going back up the hatch into the submarine. They thought maybe Templemere was still there. Of course, it wasn't. Terry and his friends calmed the situation down, explaining that they'd found a better place to stay, and they'd work out how to get everyone there. Of course, getting them there was the problem. One of the adults had been so shaken by the argument she was afraid she'd gone into labor, which nearly caused Terry to panic. Luckily, Katrina knew more about such things. She verified in short order that it wasn't actual labor. The woman wasn't due for another 2 months. Then, while the labor drama was going on, several of the younger kids decided to go exploring. Dan and Colin went to go bring them back. By this time, Terry decided he couldn't leave the rest of them alone, and it was late. The adults were in no condition to take charge, which was obviously why Doc had put him in charge in the first place. Two of the women just sat and stared at the walls in shock. They could barely care for their own children, to the point that two of the other mothers did so for them. The last two were quite pregnant and needed to rest. Added to this, the kids were becoming unruly. Terry left Taiki in charge while Katrina, Dan, Colin, and he returned to the Karamon base to explore, then spend the night. Taiki wasn't happy, but Terry didn't care. Back at the base, he had the bottlenoses do a check outside. They came back an hour later, confirming the Zictal were still searching the area, though it didn't appear they'd found the sub. They'd bedded down in the open, not far from the armory he'd found. He didn't want to sleep in the buildings yet. Simply put, he didn't trust them. Better to be able to make a run for the moon pool if something weird happened while they slept. He got out of the simple sleeping roll he'd brought and checked on the others. Colin and Dan were still asleep, but Katrina was standing near a building looking at its wall. "What's going on?" he asked. She looked up and grinned when she saw him, giving him her patented wink. "Come over here. You might be interested in this." "What?" he said as he walked over. He couldn't see anything other than a wall. "Just watch," she said, and slipped her hand into his. She was warm and felt good. He smiled from ear to ear. Then one of the triangular panels suddenly swung up, and a little animal skittered out. "Wow," he said, and jumped back. She hung on and kept him from retreating further. "It's okay. Take a closer look." He thought it was a spider, but it wasn't alive. He could see mechanical components, and it had a pair of large, multifaceted eyes, along with a single antenna. "What is it?" "It's a robot," she said, "a lot more advanced than any I've ever seen before, even in the Union." The machine skittered right toward them. Terry was about to move when it changed course, skirted around the two young people, then resumed its course. He took out his slate and snapped a digital image. With the picture, he ran a comparison in the Galnet. "Multi-environment Type 92 service bot," the slate informed him. "No longer in service. Last used during the Great Galactic War." The robot skittered out of view. Instead of following, he clicked to find out more about the war. The Great Galactic War between the Dusman and the coalition led by the Karamon occurred more than 20,000 standard years ago. Involving all the major member races of the First Republic, the war lasted 322 years and cost many trillions of sentient lives. After the mutual destruction of the Dusman and the Karamon, the peacemakers brought the remaining hostilities to an end and were instrumental in the forming of the Galactic Union, a government designed to make large-scale warfare impractical. "Wow," Katrina said as she read over her shoulder. "Did you know about this?" "No," he admitted. "I wonder if Doc was going to teach about it in MST later." He shrugged. "Where'd the robot go?" "Don't know," she said. "Another will be along. I've seen 3 so far. You know, this explains why everything's so clean." "Yeah," she agreed. "I guess these Karamon left the base and the robots keep it running." The power system said it had something called a thermal tap. "I think it gets power from the planet, and there's a fusion power plant too. This whole place is weird. Here, come into this room." Terry took her to the armory and watched her eyes bug out at all the guns and stuff. "And this is a manufactory." "Whoa," she said, running a hand along it. "It's a tiny one." Well, auto chefs are a kind of manufactory. Since this one is here, it's probably designed to make weapons and stuff. So maybe this is an abandoned military base, she suggested. You know, that makes sense. He suddenly felt like someone was watching him. Maybe there were Karaman around? He used a slate to find out what they looked like. No data, it told him. Maybe it was the data he'd never loaded. Also, the Karaman were all gone, according to the Galnet. The Duzman and the Karaman had exterminated each other. There were no pictures or details on the Duzman, either. All he cared was they were gone, and that meant the base was theirs for the taking. Colin and Dan were awake when they came out. Katrina explained about finding the little robots. One obliged by skittering by just as she'd finished her story. This time they followed it. The machine led them to a building near the center of the dome, where it went in through a tiny door. Terry walked around until he found a full-size door and touched it. Nothing happened. This is the first one I couldn't get into, he said, and tried again. Nothing. All three of the others tried as well, with no luck. Maybe we can sneak through when the robot comes back out, Dan suggested. Pretty small hole, Colin said. Taiki would fit. Dan, go back and relieve him, okay? Dan frowned. See if you can organize everyone to move. The bottlenoses said the aliens haven't found the sub yet, so go up and get all the dry suits and survival bubbles you can, so we can prepare to move everyone here. Don't take long at the sub. We'll be back this afternoon to help. Okay, he said, though Terry could see he still wasn't happy about it. We might as well keep looking around while we wait for Taiki, Katrina suggested. Consulting the map on his slate, Terry could see 5 buildings he hadn't investigated yet. One was the biggest by far, and he headed for it. Keep an eye out for more robots, he told the others. I don't exactly trust them. They're just robots, Katrina said. Just robots, Terry thought. That didn't comfort him at all. They reached the big building. Terry didn't have to look far for a door. One was already open. Like the portal that hadn't responded to him, this was another first. For some reason, he had a strange feeling, and he drew his laser pistol and peered carefully around the corner. You see something? Colin whispered. No, he admitted. I'm getting jumpy, he thought, and holstered the gun. This was the first building he'd found that wasn't a big open structure. The door opened into a short hallway, and he could see doors on either side and one at the end. All of them were also open, but no lights were on inside. The lights in the hall matched the same pattern as every other building, scattered and rather dim. They walked into the building and slowly down the hall. They still had their dry suits on, so each took one of the flashlights from their helmets to see better. Katrina pointed hers at the ground. Look, she said, dust. The robots don't come in here. I wonder why, Colin asked. They're afraid of the vampires, Terry said. Both looked at him, agog. I was trying to be funny. Stop trying, Colin said. Yeah, Katrina agreed. Sorry. Katrina narrowed her eyes at him, and he shrugged. She sighed and put her hand on the green spot, and the door opened for her. When the light from her flashlight fell inside, and she saw what was there, she screamed. Terry jerked the laser pistol from its holster and tried to move around Katrina. She was frozen in the middle of the doorway, gasping for breath. He managed to pull her sideways to reveal the threat. Skeletons. They're not human, he said. I know, she said, turning and grabbing him around the neck. Hot tears fell on his face. It's just all this going on. It would have freaked me out, too, he said, holstering the weapon. If I'd opened the door, I probably would have shot the shit out of everything. She gave a coughing laugh. If you two are done smooching? Colin asked. We're not smooching, Terry complained. Yes, we are, Katrina said, and kissed him. Colin groaned and rolled his eyes. You came to my rescue, she exclaimed. He shrugged. That almost makes up for the vampire bit. Not in my book, Colin said. You want a kiss, too? Terry asked. Colin flipped him a rude gesture. Can we see what's inside now? The room was maybe 8 meters on a side, and a dozen or more skeletons were scattered about. There were 6 low pallets, which reminded Terry of Japanese-style beds. 2 of the skeletons were lying on them, adding validity to the concept. He knew they weren't human because they possessed long necks and almost alligator-type jaws, which came to a point and were full of sharp teeth. They weren't very big, Katrina noted, kneeling next to one on a pallet. She was right. In life it had probably been no bigger than a large dog. Despite its size, its rear legs were longer, so it might have stood upright like humans, and it was about 1.5 meters tall. With so many teeth, he didn't think he'd want to meet a living one. I wonder if these were Karaman, he said aloud. He took some pictures with his slate. It couldn't hurt. Why didn't the robots take the bodies away? Colin asked. They just left them here to rot. Gross, Katrina said. The 3 moved around the room that Terry was thinking of as a bunk room, examining the skeletons. He knelt down next to one that was lying over a pallet and saw a tiny angular hole in its head. Carefully moved the skull, which detached from the long neck, causing a few vertebrae to fall away and rattle to the floor. He found another hole roughly on the opposite side of the head. I think this one was shot in the head, Terry said. This one too, Colin said across the room. Same here, Katrina noted. They spent a minute going from skeleton to skeleton, verifying. They had all been shot in the head in an obvious scene of mass execution. In total, there were 14 skeletons. Other than the bones, the room was only rusty with some discolorations on the floor or pallets around the bodies. Terry guessed if they were Karaman, they might have been killed 20,000 years ago. He wondered if the people who'd first gone into the Egyptian pyramids felt like he did. Let's see what's in the other rooms, Terry said. They exited the bunk room and crossed the narrow hall. Katrina touched the green space and the door opened. Terry had a hand on his laser pistol, just in case. The room was the same size as the other, with 3 long tables less than a meter high. A machine took up half the length of one wall. Terry went over to the machine, and his display came alive on it. He used his slate to translate. Auto Chef online, nutrient reserve status low. Food, heat, safety, Terry said. Looks pretty good to me, Katrina agreed. Going to be tough getting the little kids down here, Colin said. Harder for the moms with little babies, Terry agreed. As soon as Taiki gets back, we'll see if this will work. What about the last room? Katrina asked, pointing back out to the hallway. Yeah, let's check it out, Colin agreed. Terry shrugged, and they approached the last door. He was mentally comparing the spaces they'd discovered so far in the building against its exterior size, and guessed more than half was left. Katrina opened the door and verified his estimate. After finding a lunchroom and a bunkhouse full of skeletons, he guessed he couldn't be surprised. He was wrong. What the hell? Katrina said. All 3 entered and looked at what they could see. 3 cubicle-style workstations were in front of them, and a line of clear tubes to either side. The tubes were full of water, and a creature was suspended in each one. Terry walked over to the nearest workstation, while his friends wandered over to look at the tubes. Like every other machine he'd encountered so far, the workstation came alive. This one had a complicated wraparound tri-V instead of a flat display, which made it much harder to translate through his slate. He had to hold the slate at just the right angle and distance, which took several tries. Codex status, standing by. Codex, he said aloud. What does that mean? The submenus were no help either. Codex correlation, biome codex indexing, task codex assimilation, and many more options like them. The words had meaning, but didn't help him understand what they meant in the current context. A few of the menu selections were like the big computer, not translated at all. After a few minutes, he realized his friends were gone. Since he wasn't learning anything, he got up to see where they were. The workstation shut down as soon as he was a meter away from it. It turned out there were 6 small corridors running off from the entry area. They were both halfway down one of them, looking at more tubes. As they entered one of the corridors, more subdued lights came on. What did you find? He asked. Katrina pointed to the line of tubes in the corridor. Look at these, she said. Bunch of different fish, he said. He leaned in closer to examine the one next to him. It was a little like a lobster, only much larger. Probably a meter long, it also had a tail that split at the end, and no obvious eyes. It looked like it could be alive. There was no sign of decay. Not different, Colin said, and pointed to the one next to it. Terry moved over and examined it. Colin was confused. It was clearly a different species. Then he spotted all the similarities. The only thing different was that the head now had eye stalks, and the second set of legs had tiny pinchers. Evolutionary examples? Keep looking, Katrina said, so he moved to the next one. 2 sets of the front legs now had pinchers, and the pinchers were segmented to provide articulation. The first set also had a fixed thumb. The eyes were now mobile and compound, and the tail was smaller, tougher, and appeared to be able to curl up under the body. There was another down the line, and the theme continued, with both front sets of limbs showing thumbs and more detailed articulation. The progression was obvious. Were they purposely modifying these lobster things? He asked. We think so, Colin said. It starts down there with a lobster creature half the size of the one you're looking at, and ends over there. Terry looked at the one Colin had indicated. It was again a little smaller than the largest, and its pinchers were basically small 3-fingered hands. He also saw unmistakable pin plants on the side of its head. Hey, how are these here? Aren't they 20,000 years old? Katrina moved her foot through the millimeters-thick dust on the floor, just like the rest of the building. Hard to say how old, but nobody's been in here for a long time. Terry looked for a display on the cylinders. There wasn't one. There were 9 tubes in the corridor, taking the lobster from a simple creature to one that would have been at home, wandering through karma. Wait, he said, there's a term for this. He went into the personnel files on his slate. He'd downloaded a ton of books and videos while aboard Teddy Roosevelt. He typed in a few search words, and up came a term. Uplifting, he said. They call this uplifting, taking a species from basically an animal all the way to full sentient beings. Doc talked about how they thought some races looked, well, designed. He looked at the final stage of the lobster thing. What are the others like? They went to the next corridor. This creature looked like a sea snake he'd seen in an aquarium on Honolulu. Over the next 5 cylinders, it became bigger, its eyes more forward-focused, and it grew tentacles on either side of the head, which must be manipulative limbs. Unlike the lobster, it didn't have a pin plant, and seemed to suddenly stop in mid-uplift. Failed project, he wondered? 3 of the remaining corridors had progressive examples of different creatures. One reminded him of a sea urchin. There were only 4 examples. Apparently it hadn't worked out early on. The next was a sort of shark with armored plates on its body. This one had 7 examples, the most of any, and ended with pin plants and 6 crab-like limbs, 2 with vicious pinchers, the rest more like hands. The last was a dead ringer for a cuttlefish. Like the lobster, it hadn't started out with eyes, but they'd quickly added them in. It had only made it to the 5th iteration, where it ended without pin plants. I think the pin plants signified that they graduated, Terry said. God, I hope not, Katrina said. Why? Colin wondered. Because that means there are giant armored sharks out in the galaxy? At least they don't have laser beams on their heads, Terry said. She giggled. They'd both watched those movies a week earlier. It seemed like a million years now, as he remembered everyone was dead. He put it out of his mind. The last of the 6 corridors wasn't a gallery of uplifted alien sea life. Instead, it led to another doorway. Terry opened this one himself. He wasn't bothering with a gun anymore. It seemed there was nothing more dangerous here than long-dead alien science experiments and dust. This room seemed to be the remainder of the large dome, or about a quarter of the space along the back wall. It looked rather boring compared to the dozens of cylinders full of half-uplifted alien creatures. There were a pair of workstations like the ones in the entry area, one to either side of the door. Further back toward the wall sat a series of a dozen blocky structures set into the floor. The curve of the back wall was interrupted halfway down from the curved ceiling, and came straight down, suggesting there was something behind it out of view. The only thing that seemed out of place was an empty cylindrical clear tank mounted on treads with several manipulator arms attached. Terry moved closer to examine it, and found the glass covered in a light residue, as if whatever liquid had once been in it had evaporated, leaving a dried scum on the sides. In the bottom were a couple of inlets and outlets that had probably purified the water, a couple of pieces of corroded electronics that might have been pin plants, and what looked to him like a bird's beak. "What is this place?" Katrina asked aloud. She was looking at one of the blocky structures, which showed no response to her presence. "Maybe a lab?" Colin suggested. He looked at the tracked tube Terry was examining. This was an experiment when they all started shooting each other? Terry went to a workstation and used his slate again once it came alive, like the others in the entry area. Project suspended, standing by. Analysis available. He stared at the options for a moment. Other items in the display noted available quantities on hand of things called biofilm, gene silencers, mutagens, and phages. None of the terms made sense to him, though his translator recognized them. At least as many others were untranslated. Analysis available was highlighted, so he reached into the Tri-V and touched it. The entire display flashed blue, and another much larger Tri-V came alive. "What did you just do?" Katrina asked, accusation in her voice. "It's just a lab," he replied, and shrugged. "What can it do?" She opened her mouth to tell him when the new display resolved into an obvious representation of the structures within the dome. He held up his slate, which translated more of the buildings. Habitation, life support, thermal tap, backup fusion power, stores 1, stores 2, armory, labs, and pool. Then a series of white spots appeared. A dozen or so in the pool, and 3 in the lab. "That's us!" Colin pointed at the lab. "Which means those are the cetaceans," Terry said, and pointed at the pool. As they watched, the simple spots of white grew into perfectly rendered Tri-V dolphins and orcas. Curious and emboldened by his success at bringing the view up, he reached out and touched the pool area. It expanded to take up the entire viewing area. Like any alien-made Tri-V, the image was true to life in full detail. He recognized Moloko with her calf Pokale, Maka, Cray, and the other orcas, along with numerous bottlenoses. One by one, the representations of each cetacean was taken apart layer by layer, completely deconstructed down to their skeleton, and then popping back into existence. "Whoa," Katrina said. "That's freaky. What's it doing?" "Scanning them," Terry said. He touched the display and moved his hand sideways until the lab and their 3 shapes were visible. It was more than a little disconcerting to watch themselves live from above, all their actions perfectly copied. Colin looked up at the ceiling, and his miniature did the same thing. "That's even more freaky," Katrina said. Then the miniature Katrina's clothes disappeared. She squealed, and her hands went to her privates. Her skin was gone, then muscles, and so on. Terry had been momentarily titillated, then blanched as she was stripped to the bones, just like the cetaceans, only to pop back to normal. He was next, and it all happened too fast for his belated attempt at modesty to work any better than Katrina's had. Colin looked from them to the display just in time to be looking at his own naked miniature. "What the heck?" he barked as the skin disappeared. He glared at Terry. "Not like I can control it," Terry said. Katrina looked at them both peevishly, her cheeks flushed bright red. Terry turned to look at the workstation display. All analysis complete was displayed. Marine mammal, fully actionable, non-resident. Analysis results. Size class 6, biome type 3, tech index 1, combat index 9, sapient stage 5, candidate stage 8. Marine mammal, fully actionable, non-resident. Analysis results. Size class 3, biome type 3, tech index 9, combat index... Oh, interesting. Combat index 3, sapient stage 6, candidate stage 10, special alert, multi-level nav candidate. Land mammal, partly actionable, non-resident. Analysis results. Size class 2, biome type 2/4, potential 356, tech index 7, combat index 10, sapient stage 9, candidate stage 10. "Is the last one us?" Katrina asked. "Think it is," Terry said. "The first must be the orcas, and the second the bottlenoses. It looks like the system's evaluated them for uplifting." "And us, too," Colin pointed out. "Sapient stage 9? I guess it thinks we aren't quite as far from monkeys as we think we are." They all laughed. Katrina made a chimpanzee sound, and they laughed again. "How's it getting all this?" she asked. "The best scanners we have on Earth are huge and take minutes to get even a fraction of the kind of data they've gotten in seconds. It must have scanned our DNA." "Those panels," Terry said, snapping his finger. "They reminded me of something. The walls of the Tri-V Theater on the Behemoth have similar panels. They're sensors. Really, really good ones." "I guess," Katrina said. "Did you see—" "Nope," Terry said, hoping he wasn't blushing. He moved the big Tri-V display to the Armory building and touched it. Once again it zoomed in, and data began to scroll. "Manufactory standing by. Available. 500 Class 1 Type 234 configurable beam weapons. Available. 100 Class 2 Type 234 configurable projectile weapons. Available. 400 units configurable armor." It continued to list more items, but didn't translate them. He was pretty sure he understood some of it, which made sense from what they'd seen in the armory. There were a lot of guns. He tapped at the displays of weapons, but it just flashed at him. After the third time, a line of text appeared. "Configure to match candidate?" "You better stop before you break something," Colin said. "This thing is 20,000 years old," Terry scoffed. He glanced at his watch and saw that Dan had been gone over 3 hours. He was about to use the radio relay through the base comms when Dan's voice came over loud and full of panic. "They're here!" he yelled. "The crabs snuck into the sub! They're coming in!" The transmission cut off suddenly. "Dan!" Terry said into the radio. "Get out of there! Go! Leave! Get everyone through to here!" No response came back. The three friends stood in shock, staring at each other, none of them knowing what to say or do. Chapter 15. Karaman Base, Planet Hoarfrost, Lupasha System, Koro Region, Tolo Arm. May 14th, 2038. "What do we do?" Katrina asked. "We have to do something," Colin agreed. Terry stared at the armory display. Hundreds of guns. They just needed to be made usable. Could he and his two friends take on all the alien mercs? The answer was almost certainly no. With advanced weaponry, maybe they could kill a whole bunch of them. Everyone else was probably dead. They were it. He glanced at his two friends, who were having an animated argument about what to do, momentarily forgetting Terry was there as well. He leaned over and tapped the armory display. It pulsed blue. Configure to match candidate. He touched the beam weapons, then reached over and touched land mammals. Both pulsed yellow. Define combat environment 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He stared at the highlighted 3, 5, and 6. It had said the land mammals, he and his friends, were potentially for those biomes. He knew biome likely meant environment, and as the cetaceans were biome 3, that must be water. Humans were already good for 2 and 4. What did those mean? Air and something else. He needed guns that worked underwater or anywhere else. He clicked 2, 3, and 4. Candidate biome adaptation required. Proceed. Artificial adaptation. Biome adaptation made him nervous. However, artificial didn't sound bad. He clicked it. Candidate interface necessary. Proceed. There wasn't a second option on this one, so he clicked. Initiate. Additional action. His eyes moved to the cetaceans. Without thinking it through, he clicked Additional Action, then all 3 categories, and clicked on the cetaceans. The options were more varied there. He took all the highest actions he could and accepted as fast as possible. "What are you doing?" Katrina asked, finally realizing Terry was doing something. "Getting even," he said. "No," she said, "you don't. Initiate additional action." "Terry!" Colin yelled. Terry pushed Initiate. Immediately, the back wall of the building began to come alive. Hidden panels opened and began to configure into all manner of tables and supports. The block structures he'd thought were fixed to the floor fairly exploded into mobile machines sporting all manner of arms. One grabbed Katrina, who screamed in alarm. "Hey," Terry said, fear making him jump away from the workstation and back away. Katrina struggled and got an arm free. Instantly, a robot tentacle shot in and jabbed her in the arm. She screamed and began to go limp. "Stop it," Terry said and drew his laser pistol. "I just said give us guns!" But another robot had grabbed him, and several arms secured his arms and legs, while another snatched the pistol away. "Colin, run!" But his friend stood in stunned surprise as he, too, was snatched by still another robot. Suddenly, half the wall split open, and several of the column's robots came out of the opening, which, Terry realized, was only a few meters from the water. Spider robots were everywhere, climbing up his legs and swarming into the building. Outside, still more were skittering into the water. He could see one of the bottlenoses standing on its tail, looking in his direction. He opened his mouth to scream a warning and felt an icy sting in his arm. Terry, to his horror, never lost consciousness, not even when he was placed on a table and felt a machine begin to drill into his skull. He could only think of the dead creatures in the dormitory and silently scream in pain. There were no words for the feeling as something entered his skull. What followed was a short eternity of unintelligible feelings, emotions, and sensations as the alien machines inserted probes into his cerebellum. For a moment, he was sure he had an extra arm. Then he could smell colors, and then taste numerical formula. He wanted to scream, but was beyond the ability to use his own body in the way he wanted to. Eventually, he was carried by a big, blocky robot and stood against a wall facing the open side of the room. He expected to simply fall over and smash his face on the floor, but instead found himself standing perfectly still and balanced. He couldn't even move his eyes. An army of spider robots arrived, carrying first one, then more bottlenoses. He couldn't control his body, yet tears rolled down his cheeks as he watched the robots place them in shallow pools that hadn't been there before, and the blocky robots began to insert needles into the dolphins' bodies. Like him, they were still awake, their eyes open as probes were inserted into their skulls. Other robots removed the helmets that held the rebreathers that allowed them to stay underwater for weeks at a time. The equipment was discarded in a pile like so much junk. Then incisions were made in their sides, and pieces of technology were inserted. Terry couldn't see what, only that the incisions didn't seem to bleed. The bottlenoses were moved through quickly, operated on, then taken away several at a time. Eventually, as far as Terry could tell, all of them were moved through. Then the first orca was moved in. Despite the despair he was feeling, he was also amazed that the alien robots had created carefully constructed harnesses to avoid injuring the huge cetaceans, who had never been meant to be unsupported on land, even in Hoarfrost's lower gravity. Where the bottlenoses were worked on 3 at a time, the orcas were individual jobs, requiring a vast number of spider robots, as well as all of the big blocky robots. Terry tried to close his eyes, but he couldn't. Like the bottlenoses, their rebreather helmets were removed, and bloodless surgery used to insert equipment into their bodies. He was forced to watch as each of the 9 adult orcas were brought in for surgery, then removed back to the moon pool. At last, Pokale was brought in. "Please, no!" he mentally screamed, but to no avail. The orca calf was subjected to the same procedure as the adults, though he needed much less of the robot's assistance or time. Then it was all over. The pools and equipment used to support the cetaceans were reabsorbed by the building, the wall went away, and the blocky robots went back to being columns attached to the floor. Not a single drop of blood remained. It was as if nothing had happened. Terry must have slept, though he had no memory of it. He went from having no control of his body, standing in the corner of the operating room of horrors, watching the robots, cutting up his friends, to lying on the floor and blinking up at the dim lighting. "Terry, are you awake?" "Yeah," he said, and slowly sat up. Everything looked different. He could hear the quiet hum of fans or pumps, see the low lighting and shapes of inactive blocky robots, smell a slight ozone odor, feel the cool floor under him, taste an acid flavor of some kind, and sense available connections. Wait, sense connections? He concentrated, and the familiar idea of his slate seemed to appear in his mind's eye. He touched the connection, and the home menus of his slate appeared. In his mind. Another connection was operations control. He touched that one, and it was the same one he'd used a slate to access in the medical theater prior to approving the horror. "Why can I see computers in my head?" Colin asked. "We all have pin plants," Terry said. "Why did you do this?" Katrina asked. "Because the aliens are going to find this place and kill all of us anyway," he admitted. "Do you want to let that happen and do nothing?" "No," she admitted. "I wanted to know what was about to happen, though." "I wasn't sure myself until I did it," he said. Terry got to his feet. It was surprisingly easy. He didn't feel any pain, discomfort, or disorientation. Considering that he'd just had a hole drilled into his brain, he found the lack of after effects more than a little disconcerting. "Did they really drill holes in our heads?" Colin asked, echoing his thoughts. "Didn't you feel it?" Katrina asked. "Sort of," Colin said. "You'd think it would hurt more to have a hole drilled in your head." "I'll never forget what red tastes like," Katrina said, and shuddered. As he walked around, Terry remembered all his studies on pin plants as he'd researched the cetaceans' models. There was a section on calibration, where the recipient was fed specific impulses and their responses monitored to be sure the nanoprobes were in the correct part of the recipient's brains. At the thought, complete 3D renderings of his brain appeared in his mind, including the thousands of microscopic filaments now woven throughout it. If this machine did it so easily, why aren't they available on Earth yet? He wondered. Remembering the cetaceans' implants, he reached up to the side of his head and felt a tiny connection point behind his right ear and another behind his left. They were much smaller than he expected, and he wondered why. Combat-qualified implant includes wireless synaptic terahertz frequency modulated interface. He blinked as he digested the statement. A complete user manual appeared in his mind to go with it. He absorbed the entire manual in less than a second. "Holy crap," he said. "What?" Katrina asked. "I just read a 2,000-page manual in a second." He thought about how to interface his pin plants with a strange computer and instantly knew how, where in the manual it was located, and word for word cross-indexed uses. "And I remember all of it." "Do the orcas have the ability too?" she asked. "They must," he said, "though they don't have these models." The details on the orcas' implants were shown to him, including updates the caretaker had performed. The implants, while simple, were sufficient, so they weren't replaced, merely augmented. "How do you read manuals?" Colin asked. Terry found his connection, linked their minds, and sent him the manual. "Just read it," he said. Colin was on his feet, standing a short distance away. He closed his eyes, and his eyebrows wrinkled in concentration. Suddenly his eyes shot open, and he blinked. "Oh, wow!" "I know, right?" Terry said. "I see," Katrina said. "Found it and read it. This is a little like VR, except without stupid goggles." "Yeah, kinda," Terry agreed. "It's 3D. Like the weird programming," he thought. Like so many other things with the pin plants, one of those 3D programs appeared. Kut-a-ki was the programming language. It didn't translate, not even in the deeper understanding granted by the pin plants. He looked at the strange 3D program, and a tiny bit seemed to make sense. "What do we do now?" Katrina asked, snapping him back to reality. "The caretaker says we're free to act," Colin said. "Wait, caretaker?" "That's the computer of this base," Katrina said, and made an expansive gesture around her. Terry found the main connection again and linked with it. "Caretaker? What do you require?" "It talks!" Terry blurted. "You just realized?" Katrina asked. He was glad she didn't hate him as much as he hated himself. "Did you notice your leg?" Colin said, and pointed. Terry looked down at his left leg and gawked. Gone was the mechanical-looking prosthetic made by Doc's people. It still wasn't his leg, but it looked just like it. Perfectly molded, he suspected, from his right leg. It worked perfectly, and it looked perfect except that it was a metallic tint of blue. He reached down and touched it. The skin felt like the same material as the dome. His dry suit had been cut and molded to seal where the artificial leg met his stump. "They're very efficient," he thought. "I am waiting," the caretaker said in his mind. "Will you do whatever I ask?" he said. "Within programmed parameters, absent command override." "Who gives command override?" Katrina asked. Terry hadn't been aware that she was there in his mind with him. He thought about it and understood that she wasn't. They were just on the same channel communicating with the caretaker. "Information beyond your authority." "This is frustrating," Colin said, also on the channel. "Irrelevant. What do you require?" "What did you do to the orcas?" Terry asked. "Candidate species orca, now designated Kill Shaw, upon consulting with candidate, as per protocol. Actions per operator Terry include as follows. All three of them saw 3D images of the surgeries performed on the orcas, now Kill Shaw, as well as alterations to their DNA. The caretaker stated the Kilshaw were now sapient stage 6, which was the best alteration possible within the current generation. You uplifted them? He asked. Indexing operator language. Term uplift acceptable analogy and is indexed within database. Kilshaw partially uplifted and adapted as requested. God, Terry, Colin hissed aloud. I didn't think it would change them, he pleaded. I thought it would arm them. You just didn't think, Katrina said. Terry sighed and nodded. Are the orcas, the Kilshaw, okay? The back wall of the room split open again. All three stepped back, the memory of the flood of robots too fresh in their minds. There were no robots, just the moon pool a short distance away. It was crowded, with all the cetaceans sitting calmly on the surface. None of them were wearing their rebreathers, and when he looked, there was no sign of them either. The three walked outside, and the wall closed behind them. Are they alive? Colin asked. A plume of water vapor and a whoosh from one of the orcas answered the question. Hello? Terry called as they reached the edge of the water. Hello, Terry, the closest Kilshaw answered. The English was perfect, and it brought goosebumps to his skin. English, without him needing a translator. For that matter, his translator was gone. How are you? We're fine, he said. Moloko, how are you? Yes, I am Moloko, and I am very fine. I'm sorry they hurt you, he said, stepping into the water enough to touch her side. Do not be sorry, Cray said, gently pushing Moloko aside to come closer. This is a great gift. They cut on you and changed you in ways you don't understand, he said. You do not understand. We asked them to do this when the caretaker's machines came for us. It needed to happen, and this is why Shul brought us here. We understand, he said. We have the files in our pin plants. We can talk perfectly now. It was so hard for us to talk before, to make humans understand us. Our language is much more different than you understand. Terry shook his head. It was disconcerting to have an orca talk to him like an adult human. Gone was the stilted speech that had been more like talking to a child, or someone with a mental disability. We are happy to be Kilshaw. All the newly made Kilshaw bobbed their heads, and some blew misty plumes as if they were exclamation points. You do not have to be wardens any more. Now we can work with you as allies, friends. Sounds wonderful, Terry said. He glanced at Katrina, who was frowning. Colin was just slowly shaking his head. I'm still sorry. I should have asked you. We would have said yes, Cray repeated. Like new brain, Terry. Pokale popped his head out and nipped at Terry's hand. Terry stroked his side, and he felt a pin plant link from the baby orca with, he would swear, a hug emoticon. Hey, little guy, Terry said. Pokale like Terry. You make Pokale have big smarts. The calf still sounded like a kid, but maybe a 3 or 4-year-old, not a 1-year-old. The changes to the youngest member of the pod were the most profound and hinted at what was to come. Sup, Terry? A bottlenose rocketed out of the water between Cray and Moloko, did a triple flip, and hit the water on the other side perfectly, not even touching either of the Kilshaw, who both looked back and gently shook their heads. We're Botshaw now! All 18 of the former bottlenose dolphins stuck their heads out and jabbered about how awesome it was to be a Botshaw. It was like being in the middle of a crazy internet chat room full of gamers. Terry sighed and sat down at the edge of the water. Doc's going to kill me, he thought. Then winced when he remembered they were all dead. The thought brought him to the present and why he'd done what he did. You know all the wardens, all the other humans on Templemere are dead, he asked the Kilshaw. We know, Cray responded. Do you want to help me get even? Terry, Katrina hissed, what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we kill the alien bastards. Colin set his jaw and nodded. Katrina frowned more, but slowly nodded, too. The Kilshaw rolled partially onto his side and opened his mouth to show teeth no longer blunt white, but sharply pointed and glinting with a silver alloy. We want to help kill them. Caretaker? Still waiting. It somehow managed to sound impatient. Is the equipment I requested ready? Manufactory is 89% completed on weapons, standing by to begin armor fabrication. Then let's get to work. Chapter 16. Under Extractor, Planet Hoarfrost, Lupasha System, Koro Region, Tolu Arm, May 15th, 2038. Selroth Unit Commander Glute was running out of patience. The operation was taking much longer than anticipated, and his company commander was threatening repercussions. Find the cache and get it back here, the company commander yelled over the comlink. The Islian representative could be here any time, and we need to exit this entropy-cursed system before they arrive. Like everyone else in his company, Glute hadn't yet been born when some high-ranking Selroth leader had hatched the plan to falsify mineral yields on the planet's extractors. It was an intriguing deception, one that apparently worked on the gas bag Islians. Though the water burned their skin, its volcanoes belched vast quantities of valuable minerals and rare earths into the ocean. The problem was, the original plotters hadn't counted on it taking 3 centuries to yield results. That was so long nobody had remembered the plan even existed until some intelligence expert on their home world had received a cursory notification from the Islians that they'd granted a lease to a race known as humans to operate the abandoned mining colony. However, the notification triggered an old, highly classified file. Months had passed before the right people in the Selroth leadership were made aware of the situation. Panic ensued. Regardless of how long ago it was, should the Islians discover the Selroth's duplicitous dealings, the repercussions would be dire. Glut's company was hastily moved to Karma, the next closest location an unattached Merc company could go to without drawing attention. No sooner had they arrived than a coded signal came through on a courier from Lupasha. The dormant program running the extractor scheme had been triggered. The humans had found the hidden stash. The humans were the newest mercenary race in the galaxy, which concerned the commander. With only 2 platoons of Selroth Mercs, Glut's commander had decided additional firepower was warranted. The problem was, they needed Mercs who were able to operate deep underwater, were good fighters, and could keep their mouths shut. The Ziktal fit the bill. Thus reinforced, they raced to Lupasha and landed on the moon now named, for some strange reason, Hoarfrost. "What is a Hoarfrost?" the company commander had demanded. "How am I to know?" Glut had retorted. He'd never even seen a human. The humans might be a Merc race, but they weren't terribly knowledgeable about war. With the Selroth forces restricted to firing on the planet below 10 miles by Union law, it could have been a tough landing, but since there weren't any surface defenses, the Selroth landed, unloaded their submarines, and descended into the water. The Ziktal had many advantages when operating in deep ocean environments. One of them was that they could equalize their internal pressure and dive very fast. They'd arrived at the habitat dome long before the Selroth's submersibles could. One advantage the Crustacea didn't have was good tactical doctrine. They simply blew a hole in the dome and killed everyone inside. Without the humans, the Selroth didn't know where the stash was, because the dome computers were wrecked. Even fixing and repressurizing the dome didn't help. However, once inside, they found a distinct lack of bodies and a missing submarine. Thus, Glut had spent the last several days in the miserable, skin-itching water looking for the submarine and the humans. It turned out the humans hadn't been alone. They'd managed to domesticate some extremely large, predatory marine mammals. They were formidable, but luckily possessed no arms or armor. Despite this, the Ziktal had only killed one of the smaller subspecies members, while losing an entire platoon of their numbers. Glut didn't care about the losses. Let the stupid Crustacea absorb them. They'd found the submarine and what was left of the extractor stash a few hours ago, along with a bunch of unarmed humans. The pathetic bunch were huddled in the center of a cavern under the submarine, mewling piteously. Apparently several others were missing, having located another cavern. Glut had scouts searching for them. The humans watched the small circle of Ziktal troopers who surrounded them. Their soft, fleshy faces were covered in liquid leaking from their undersized eyes in some strange display. How these helpless creatures could live so far under the ice was a complete mystery. The waters at this depth felt cool to Glut. They must be freezing to these beings. They were mostly hatchlings and pregnant females. Maybe only the males were Mercs? The only human who seemed knowledgeable about the missing ones was an immature male. 2 Ziktal were trying to interrogate him. They were taking turns asking questions and using their claws to nip off bits here and there. The pathetic thing kept losing consciousness, slowing the process. He was about to just tell the Ziktal to kill the human when his radio came alive. "Search team, contact!" "Report," Glut said. "Humans in a lower tunnel. They're armed." The transmission cut off suddenly. An explosion reverberated through the cavern seconds later. "I guess the humans have a few marks after all," Glut said. "Prepare for battle." The 2 Ziktal tossed the mutilated human aside and scooped up lasers designed for their kind. These troopers didn't have weapons welded to their carapaces, like the heavy combat Ziktal or the huge king crabs. Those were more like tanks than living beings. Glut's team armed weapons, and he readied the laser carbine he carried. Something raised out of the pool slightly, and a flurry of fire from the Mercs met it. It dropped below the waves with deceptive speed. There was nothing for a long moment, then a huge metallic and glass shape rose out of the water. Glut had half a second to recognize one of the huge black and white marine mammals before he realized it was clad in combat armor. "Impossible," he said. Robotically controlled weapons on the armor moved, and Glut dove for cover. Powerful lasers raked the assembled Mercs. Selroth troopers sought cover, while the Ziktal did what they always do. They charged. They charged right into death. Glute only got a few momentary images of the marine mammal in its incredible powered armor, using precise fire from a pair of turret-mounted lasers to carve the Zictal and several of his own troopers into bloody pieces, while avoiding the screaming humans, sometimes by mere millimeters. "Withdraw," he said. "Whoever's alive, get out!" The damnable marine mammals didn't have legs, at least, so he ran for his life. He reached his submarine, which was docked to one of the extractor's ports with the remainder of his command, 9 troopers. He'd arrived with 25 and a squad of 10 Zictal. Entropy, what had he stumbled into? The last man in closed the hatch and flooded the lock with sweet water, chemically balanced the way the Selroth liked it. "Get us out of here," he screamed at the pilot, who nodded his head, bubbles popping from his mouth to show the fear in his face. "What happened?" he asked as he undocked and spun the submarine away from the extractor. "The big marine mammals have powered armor and modern weapons." "Impossible," the pilot insisted. "They would have used them already." "You would think," Glute mumbled. "However, my dead troopers would contest your statement." "What about the rest of the Zictal?" his second-in-command, Ewald, asked. "To Entropy with them." The sub's water turbine spun up to a scream as the submarine accelerated away from the extractor. Glute could see through the front cockpit bubble as all 3 of the single-man attack subs fell in with them. He activated the radio. "Be alert," he warned. "The big marine mammals have modern weapons and armor. Only lasers, though. Engage with torpedoes on first sight." "Acknowledged," the attack subs replied. With their escort, they raced away at better than 30 knots. There was no way the massive mammals could match their speed. Sonar bleated an alarm. 4 small returns raced past them at better than 50 knots. The returns were too small to be the big predators, and he thought at first that they were poorly fired torpedoes, until they slowed and turned around to face them. It was then that he remembered the smaller subspecies of marine mammals. "Engage them," he ordered the attack subs. Instantly, the 3 accelerated ahead of the transport, and Glute saw a torpedo launch from each one. The sonar was a good model and provided highly detailed 3D imagery. It zoomed in on the 4 creatures facing them, and now he could make out the sleek, long forms with powerful flippers. They had proven fast and maneuverable, but against high-tech seeker torpedoes they would be no match. The torpedoes streaked toward them at 100 knots. Glute nodded as the torpedoes unerringly sought their targets. Then, when the torpedoes were less than 100 meters away, there was a flash that made the screen white out. When it cleared, the torpedoes were gone and the marine mammals were accelerating toward them. "What happened?" Glute demanded. "A sonar burst," the pilot said. "It was extremely powerful. It overwhelmed our receivers even a kilometer away." Resolution began to return as the sub's sonar recovered from the burst, and Glute saw the torpedoes. 3 marine mammals had the torpedoes in their mouths like fish. "The sonar must have functioned as a weapon and disabled the torpedoes," the pilot said needlessly. "They'll be in laser range in 5 seconds. "Engage with lasers at close range," Glute ordered the attack subs, which acknowledged the order. The mammals raced toward them at an amazing speed. The seconds ticked down with the range, and Glute tensed in anticipation of watching the annoying creatures cut into bloody chunks. Then the images became fuzzy. "They're employing sonar again," the pilot said, manipulating his controls. "The signal is incredibly complicated, and the frequencies are slightly different from each creature." "Are you saying the sonar is a biological feature of the animals?" Before the pilot could answer, the attack subs fired their lasers, to absolutely no effect. The beams hit the sonar distortion and attenuated in less than a meter. Lasers only worked at short range underwater, and even then they were less reliable. The sonar distortion was acting almost like a laser shield. "How can they know how to do this?" Glute thought. The attack subs maneuvered out of the way of the streaking alien mammals, firing their lasers without effect, until the quarry was no longer in line with the bow-mounted weapon. As the aliens passed the attack subs, 2 of them maneuvered so they could face the subs. Another burst of sonar static came from the 2 creatures, and the attack subs spun out of control. "What happened to them?" Glute demanded. "They don't respond," the pilot said. "It was some kind of attack," the remaining attack sub-pilot yelled over the sound of his craft's straining engine. "They're not responding." A Tri-V came alive, showing the attack sub-pilot inside his wet cockpit. "Get away from them," Glute ordered the attack sub-pilot, then addressed his pilot. "Emergency speed, head for the dome." "I'm trying," the attack sub-pilot yelled. "The aliens are too maneuverable." On the display showing the attack sub and the aliens, 2 others swept around and aimed their heads at it. The distortion returned. The attack sub-pilot screamed, and the screen showed an all-too-detailed view as the pilot was hit by a concussive wave of force transmitted through his craft's wall and by the water he used to breathe, pulping his flesh. The exploding cloud of blood and tissue almost managed to obscure the view of his gaping skull. "Entropy!" his pilot gasped. Get us out of here! Wiki reports the small subs are destroyed, Ki told Terry, who was riding on his back. What about the big sub? He asked the Killshaw. They let it go as you instructed. It is fleeing at high speed back to Templemere. Excellent, Terry said. Why bother letting them get back? Katrina asked. A dozen meters away, she was astride the female Uila. Colin rode on Maka just behind them. All the members of the former wandering pod were in the second group. Cray and those from the shore pod were the lead element, with the exception of Moloko and Pokale, who remained back at the Karman base, protecting the children and mothers. The little calf was quite upset at being left out of, as he called it, the coming fun. Because I want to get back and either evacuate toward the surface or, even better, come out and try to fight. Then we kill them, Ki said. Absolutely. Scritch, are your scouts there yet? Yeah, they're checking it out now, man. Terry shook his head. The mannerisms and turns of phrase of the new Bat-Shah had him bemused. They were like some of the surfer dudes back on Hawaii. It had to be on purpose. They were all talking the same way. The Bat-Shah leader came back on the radio a minute later. Wiki says the dome is fixed and full of air, dude. How did you know they'd fixed the dome? Katrina asked. The Selroth made the dome, Terry said. They don't like this water. The water is awesome, dude, Scritch said. For you and the Killshaw, sure. Not for the Selroth. I don't know if the Ziktal like it. No matter, Cray said from further ahead. They will die in it. We'll need the dome, Terry reminded everyone. Be careful. There are a bunch of crabs coming out of the dome, Wiki called on the radio. There's crabs everywhere, dude. They're coming out to fight, Terry thought. Doc's right. Aliens are predictable. Cray, go ahead and attack their front ranks. We'll begin our flanking maneuver. Yes, General, Cray replied, a hint of humor in his voice. Don't call him General, Colin said. His head will get too big for his helmet. Terry could hear Katrina chuckling over the radio. Remember what they did to Don, Terry said, and the other two went silent. Their friend was alive, but horribly mutilated. The crabs had cut off both his feet and his right hand. And remember our families, Katrina added. It was the fact that the aliens had murdered everyone that sold her on this plan. Payback was a powerful motivator. The Killshaw just wanted to kill the aliens. Now that they were close, the Killshaw began sharing live feeds from their pin plants, constructing 3D maps in his head that the pin plants labeled a battle space. It seemed like it would be hard to separate things, but the pin plants made it easier than a computer game back home. The enemy units were highlighted in blue as they were identified, friendly in red. The colors felt strange, so he thought about it, and it reversed. As the 4 Killshaw in Cray's group swept in on the Ziktal, Terry took Ki'i and the other 4 in his group and angled sideways, then toward Templemere. The lights of the dome slowly became visible out of the gloom, where they'd tried to make a home, where Doc and his mom had died. He gritted his teeth and urged Ki'i to speed up. A pair of Bat-Shah came in from either side, matching their course and speed. Crabs ahead, dude, Wiki said. Sup, dude, Toba added from the other side. I thought you were supposed to be helping Cray's group, Terry said. Nah, he's got that. I want to hang out with you. More fun here, Toba agreed. A laser beam from below hit Niho just to Terry's right. A Ziktal's red icon appeared in Terry's head below them. The male Killshaw yawed over hard, and Terry could see the glowing line on his armor. As Niho rolled, one of the 2 laser turrets mounted on his armor's side, just behind the head, rotated and pulsed laser fire. 100 meters below them, the Ziktal who'd fired from ambush was scored several times, and the red icon disappeared. Below us, Terry said to Wiki. On it, bro! The 2 Bat-Shah rocketed downward as the Killshaw began to evade more shots coming up from below. There's a bunch of them. Let's go, Colin said. They didn't want to leave Wiki and Toba to deal with the crabs themselves, so Terry agreed, and all 5 Killshaw dove as well. The Ziktal had a squad of their troopers hidden on the rocky side of the volcano Templemere had been built on. Terry didn't think they'd planned to attack when it had happened. Maybe one of the crabs jumped the gun? Either way, the Killshaw and Bat-Shah were among them too quickly, and they were caught trying to hide from an expected attack. This was the first time Terry had been directly involved in a fight, and his heart was racing. He could feel sweat on his skin despite the armor. The caretaker called his armor a Konar, and it had been custom-built in the manufactory in only minutes. The armor the Killshaw and Bat-Shah wore was unique, and required slightly more time. With segmented armor from just behind the pectoral fins, all the way back to their flukes, Terry was amazed at the final product. The way it articulated to open and allow the operating cetaceans to simply swim into it was even more amazing. He, Katrina, and Colin had just put theirs on by climbing into it from behind, and the armor had closed over them. Doc would have loved these things, Terry thought as he watched them dive toward the enemy through his pin plants. It really was just like a video game. Each of the Killshaw's armor had an indentation just behind the dorsal fin where a human could sit. Both armors then linked systems, almost like a spaceship docking. It had once felt incredible to be towed through the water by the powerful strokes of a bottlenose. Riding on the back of a battle armor-wearing Killshaw made him feel like a god. The god of war, to be precise. Mated to Ki'i'i's back, Terry gained access to the Killshaw's own weapon system, effectively becoming like a rear gunner in a fighter. The Ziktal, realizing they couldn't escape, began firing at the diving cetaceans and their human riders. Terry saw Uila and Katrina take out a torpedo with a directed sonar blast and kill the Ziktal with their own torpedo. How do I know how to use this stuff? Katrina wondered. The pin plants are doing the heavy lifting, Terry said. Like looking up a file, Colin agreed. Point and click. Point and kill's more like it, Katrina lamented. It is glorious, Cray said, either not catching her sentiment or simply not caring. Another Ziktal was dispatched by Colin and Maka, leaving two who were trying to race away with a sort of underwater jetpack the aliens had mounted on their shells. Terry used one of Ki'i'i's lasers and hit a fleeing crab, disabling the jetpack. Ki'i'i raced in and seized the alien in his jaws. The being made a hideous screeching sound as Ki'i'i's reinforced metal teeth crushed the life out of it with an explosion of bluish blood and insides. Terry tried not to think about the fact that they'd just killed an intelligent being, focusing instead on what those beings had done to his friends and family. Further ahead, Wiki and Toba used the lasers on their own powered armor to disable the last Ziktal's jetpack and weapons. Then they moved in and tore it limb from limb with their own reinforced teeth. Wimpy crabs, Toba said when the Ziktal only had one pathetic limb left. The Ziktal was trying to crawl under a rock outcropping as blue blood pumped from its many severed limbs. The two-bot Shah harassed and snapped at it until Katrina dispatched it with a laser. Spoil sport, Wiki cried. That wasn't sport, Katrina said. It was torture. The two-bot Shah left without comment, obviously disappointed that she'd ruined their fun. Terry observed the battle space and saw that Cray's forces had neutralized all the Ziktal with only one minor injury. Bick had a pectoral fin pierced by a laser, and a torpedo had exploded against his side. The injury was minor, and his armor was still functional. They are like warships, Terry thought. The Selroth are retreating into Templemere, Cray reported. Time to finish this, Terry said. Glute ran across the open area of the dome as fast as he could, his big webbed feet making wet slapping sounds on the carved rock as he ran. One of the ridiculous paintings the humans had executed on a building was visible as he went, the image partially degraded from being flooded. This particular painting looked like the dome he was running in, with the cursed marine mammals swimming around it, though without the powered armor they now wore. How did these humans and their pets get such advanced technology? He yelled in rage as he ran. Nobody was nearby to answer him. His company commander had been outside leading the Ziktal against the same marine mammals. The initial wave of attacks had been swift and devastating. His commander had died in seconds. What's happening, Unit Commander? Asked a technician moving a loader full of equipment. We're losing, Glute said as he ran by. What should I do? Run for your life, you fool, Glute yelled over his shoulder. Thanks to Glute's widely set eyes, he had a good look at the technician, staring after him as he ran. The 3 heavy submarines were docked in the bay. He'd sent the general evacuation order the minute his commander was slaughtered. To Entropy with the High Command, the Islians, and in particular, the cursed humans and their murderous pets. If they could control the aquatic death machines, they would soon depose the Vitano from the Mercenary Guild and be running everything. If the galaxy was smart, they'd destroy the entire race now while they still could. Glute was emboldened to see an entire squad of his troopers waiting at the entrance to the main lock. All were in full combat armor with laser weapons, and one had a rocket launcher. Where are the rest of the Ziktal? A trooper asked. Dead, maybe, he said. Do you want to wait for them? They shook their heads. That's what I thought. Let's get out of this entropy-cursed place. They entered the airlock and passed through into the docking bay. Their submarines were sitting there with support crews rushing to load anything of value. Get in the subs, you fools! He yelled at them. Being non-combat personnel, they were responsible for the gear. They looked confused to be told to leave it behind. He turned toward the submarine and saw one of the armored marine mammals surface just behind it. Contact! He yelled, and raised his laser, but the mammal disappeared below the water the second it was spotted. Regardless, several of his troopers snapped shots after it. Don't waste ammo, he said. Then the meaning of the creature dawned on him. Why is the outside lock open? We opened it in preparation for departure, a technician said. He pointed at the water, where another of the smaller marine mammals was skimming the surface, apparently to get a sight picture of what was going on. You didn't consider hostile action first? The technician looked from Glute to the water, not understanding. Then the marine mammal surfaced and shot the technician with a laser, killing him instantly. Take cover, he ordered the squad, and they piled behind a concrete barrier. Lasers began snapping regularly, picking off the feckless technicians with precision fire. Half of them were gone before the rest realized they were targets. Non-combatants weren't often singled out during merc battles. There wasn't any profit in it. Finally understanding what was happening, their response was to run in circles, screaming. Suppression fire, Glute ordered. His troopers tried to help the technicians, but their panicky behavior worked against them. His own people killed 2 of them as they ran into friendly fire. Only one managed to get behind cover, leaving the dock next to the subs littered with dead and dying technicians. What do we do? A trooper asked him. We can't reach the submarines while those creatures are in the water. We wait, he said. If they want to attack us, they must rise up higher in the water. Then we can engage them from cover. Once we kill a few, they'll tire of this. But the small marine mammals didn't expose themselves. They stopped attacking, and the docking bay fell silent. He began to consider a rush for the submarines, since they had heavier weapons, when something large began to surface. He stared in horror as one of the huge marine mammals broached the surface, its laser turrets seeking targets. Fire! He yelled. The squad rose as one and targeted the creature. The segmented armor plates covering its body seemed to move, and its head dipped downward. The laser fire hit the armor and was reflected. The armor was mirror-shiny and somehow articulated. The tiny plates both deflected and broke up the beams in a way Glute had never seen. Try to concentrate on one spot, he said, but a rocket shot by him and detonated, killing 2 of his troopers. Not only had another huge marine mammal surfaced, it was walking up the landing on its massive mechanical legs. They come on land, he said in shock. The armored monster snapped its jaws, revealing rows of silver daggers. A pair of articulated arms, tipped with razor-sharp claws, gestured at them, seemingly saying, Come to me. His men threw their weapons over the barrier and raised their hands. The beast looked disappointed. Terry walked out of the water in the submarine dock, the last place he'd been in Templemere as they'd fled 5 days prior. Bodies of dead Selroth littered the deck. A couple still twitched. He carried his laser weapon in both hands as his armor-clad feet clanked against the carved stone decking. Katrina and Colin were right behind him. Cray and his mate Ulibka stood next to a group of Selroth prisoners. The Kilshaw's powered armor moved them on powerful robot legs, which served double duty as manipulators if necessary. Terry suspected the aliens had been more than shocked when 5 tons of cetacean had walked out of the water in gleaming armor. Ulibka's armor was discolored in places from laser hits, though none of them had penetrated the armor. They surrendered, Cray told him as he approached. The Selroth looked at the Kilshaw in shock. They speak? The alien said, his bubbling, gulping language instantly translated by Terry's pinplants. Yes, of course, he said. Meet the Kilshaw, our friends and allies. There is no race called Kilshaw, the Selroth said. Wiki and Toba walked out of the water, their own armor performing the same feat as the Kilshaw's to let them move on land. Those are the Botshaw, he told the Selroth. Did you uplift those creatures? The alien stammered. Terry just stared at him through the armored glass of his Konar. That's illegal! What are you talking about? Katrina asked him. Uplifting lower laces is illegal by union law, you stupid human. Do not speak to them like that, Cray snarled, his voice amplified by his sonar with enough intensity to knock the 5 surviving Selroth backward. They crawled backward until the wall stopped them. What are we going to do with them? Colin asked. Kill them, Wiki said, just like they killed all your dudes. No, Terry said, not yet, anyway. He looked at the first Selroth who'd spoken. You the leader? My commander is dead, so I'm in charge. You have a ship in orbit? The alien didn't respond. Cray, convince him to talk. Cray directed a sonar beam at the Selroth, who jerked in surprise. The attack pulsed over and over, slowly increasing in intensity. The Selroth jerked as its armor began to vibrate, then crack. Terry held up a hand and the attack stopped. Feel like talking? Yes, the alien said. We have a Merc cruiser in orbit. Terry nodded. Thank you. I'll have more questions for you. For now, stay here and don't cause any trouble. The alien looked at the 2 Kilshaw in powered armor and slowly nodded. Good boy, or whatever you are. He turned and walked back toward the dock. Their submarine was surfacing. On board would be all the children, what was left of Dan and Taiki's body. His teeth ground together as he considered killing the Selroth. "You wouldn't have let Craig kill it, would you?" Katrina asked. "Why not?" Colin asked and looked at the sub. "I don't think Taiki would have a problem with it." "I don't know," Terry said, and shrugged, his armor perfectly duplicating the movements. "The other Batshah are sweeping the facility looking for any surviving crabs or Selroth?" He'd been too busy with Cray and the Selroth to keep in touch directly. "Yeah," Katrina said. "They found a couple, but they were confused. The huge crab Cray killed outside was their boss. Now the others don't know what to do." He nodded. The file he had on the Ziktal confirmed the information. Leaderless, the crabs were clueless. They could also be unpredictable. "Are they killing them?" "Yes," Katrina said in an emotionless voice. "Needed to be done." They walked out of the docking bay, through the airlock, and into the dome. Everything looked so familiar. Had it really been just 5 days? It was disconcerting. A pair of armored Batshah walked by on their robotic limbs. They were chatting like a pair of guys heading out to surf, but they were talking about how fun it was to kill Ziktal and hoping there were more. Behind them, it was the mural Terry had helped paint of a shining dome under the water where orcas and dolphins played. A tear rolled down his cheek, and he shook his head angrily. There was no place for regret in his world. Not anymore. "Are you okay?" Katrina asked. "Yeah, I suppose," Terry said. She stepped next to him and slipped her armored hand into his. "We'll get through this," she said. "Somehow." Colin put his hand on Terry's shoulder. "We saved the kids," he said. Terry pointed at the Batshah walking into a building, lasers at the ready. "At what cost?" "Terry, dude!" "What's going on, Ehu?" Terry asked, responding to the call sent through their linked pin plants. "Come to the moon pool, man, right away!" All three of them ran on their power-assisted legs, far faster than they would have been able to without, reaching the door to the moon pool in just seconds. They had to wait for a second as the lock cycled before they could go inside. He was expecting to find a bunch of dead Ziktal or maybe a holdout group of Selroth. The inside door opened, and they moved in, weapons at the ready, to find a crowd of people. "What?" he said, stopping and lowering his weapon. "Terry?" His armored head turned at the sound, and he saw his mom moving to the front of the group. "God, Terry, is that you? Mom?" At a mental command, his helmet split open and pivoted up. "How?" Doc appeared and shook his head. "Jesus Christ, kid." He gestured at the three armored teenagers. "How? What?" The armor opened, and he climbed out the egress point in the rear. Coming around the armor, he grabbed his mom and hugged her as hard as he could. She cried on his shoulder, and he did the same in her hair. "You're alive," he said over and over. Katrina was with her mom and dad, and so was Colin, though they were still in their armor for some reason. Everyone was there, the entire colony. They'd all survived. "Bodacious," Ehu said, and used his robotic manipulator to flip Terry a recognizable shaka. "How are you all alive?" he asked Doc, who nodded in approval. His mercs were examining the empty armor, and in particular the laser carbine it still held. "Backup power room under the moon pool," Doc said. "We only found it the day of the attack." He shrugged. "It wasn't even on the maps. We were rushing everyone who couldn't fight down here when they blew the dome. Barely got the door closed in time. Me and the guys were just trying to figure out how to make a breakout when the shooting started." Terry nodded. "I can't believe you're alive. I have so much to tell you." "I bet," Tina said from next to Terry's empty Konar. "Maybe you should put some pants on before we talk about this." It was only then that Terry remembered they had to be naked in the armor for them to work properly. Tina raised an eyebrow and nodded in appreciation. "Not bad, kid. Not bad at all." Epilogue. Templemere, Planet Hoarfrost, Lupasha System, Koro Region, Tolo Arm. December 25th, 2038. Terry watched the younger children singing a Christmas carol on the stage with a small smile on his face. Dr. Orsage was still working with them on therapy sessions. Despite none of their parents actually dying, the battles and watching Dan being tortured had left scars that had yet to heal. They might never completely heal, Orsage said. Time would tell. Katrina squeezed his hand, and Terry smiled at her. He'd been careful with her after the events back in May. Part of him wanted to do things with her, but part of him wasn't ready for those things. He'd turned 14 back in October. He felt like he was 40. His mom and Doc, on the other side of Katrina, watched the kids' performance and clapped at the end. The children began another song. Terry's smile faded as he looked up and saw the Kilshaw watching from outside the dome. Some of the Batshah were there, too, but most of them were still off on their last mission. The ones who remained were pregnant and getting ready to have their own families. The anti-fertility drugs had been stopped right after the battle at their insistence. Breeding had commenced in the pod with embarrassing regularity. The mission was with the Kilshaw on their seemingly never-ending search for Shul. Terry had thought that after they'd been uplifted, the Kilshaw would give up their quest to meet God in the cold depths of hoarfrost. Nothing could be further from the truth. Along with the other modifications to the former orcas and bottlenoses, they now could dive deeper and return quickly, without ill effects. The Kilshaw watched the performance silently, without moving so much as a centimeter. They seemed to be completely engrossed in the proceedings. They wore their konar as they usually did. The armor was quite comfortable, and Terry wore his whenever he went out as well. The Batsha mostly weren't wearing theirs, as they said the armor was uncomfortable when they were pregnant. "Do you want to listen too?" He sent the question through his pin plants to the Kilshaw and Batsha in general. "Yes," Pokale replied right away. Yes, please." "That would be rad, dude," Wiki replied. Terry had been surprised to find out she was pregnant at the time of the fight, and had never considered whether to participate. Terry set his pin plants to record and relay, and the cetaceans listened to a bunch of children singing jingle bells. He looked up and saw the half-dozen Batsha bobbing their heads in time with the song, and chuckled. "What?" Katrina asked. Terry tilted his head up. She followed his gaze and chuckled. The Batsha were singing along, and Terry added her to the channel. "What are you two laughing about?" Doc asked, leaning over Terry's mom to stage whisper at him. "The Batsha are singing jingle bells," Terry said, and pointed at the cetacean audience. "How do you know they're singing?" his mom asked. Terry reached up and touched the external connection on his pin plants. She blanched and looked away. Like the little kids, his mom hadn't quite come to grips with the events of the Selroth invasion. He recognized Cray in the group of Kilshaw. He was noticeably bigger, and his dorsal fin had a particular curl to it. Shortly after the battle, he'd asked Cray about the name Kilshaw. The caretaker had said that an uplifted race's name came from their species name, with Shah added to the end by some tradition. "You should have been Orc Shah," he told Cray. "We know, but we chose to use killer whale instead. Kilshaw." "Why?" "Because we like to kill." He'd have sworn the whale was smiling when he said it. At the back of the audience, the 11 surviving Selroth were sitting uncomfortably on chairs, pointedly ignoring the goings-on. They were basically permanent prisoners. After Terry had explained about the law against uplifting, and Doc had verified it through the Galnet, it had been agreed that the Selroth couldn't go home, and the grown-ups couldn't bring themselves to kill them outright. They were also a little horrified that the Batsha really wanted to kill the aliens. The Selroth were being cooperative in getting the habitat fully operational. In exchange for their cooperation, they were given a large amount of freedom and good treatment. They refused to go anywhere near the cetaceans, in a mixture of fear and revulsion. Terry, Colin, and Katrina, along with Doc and his crew, rode the shuttle up to the Selroth's ship in orbit and took it from them. Terry and his people did most of the work. Their konar easily handled the pressure differential they needed to maintain to avoid ill effects. The mercs had to wear clunky pressure suits and ended up being little more than observers. 4 of the 11 Selroth were the surviving crew. Terry's mother had nearly freaked out when he got back in his konar armor and went with Doc. They'd taken 2 of the Batsha because the former bottlenose dolphins had insisted. There really wasn't a fight. The Selroth hadn't been expecting an attack from their own shuttle. Afterward, Doc's people treated Terry, Colin, and Katrina differently. They'd exchanged a nod with him when they walked by. Sometimes at mealtime they'd lift a glass in his or his friend's direction. He'd asked Doc about it once. "We're part of the same club," he said. "You're too damned young, but you're one of us now." They'd flown the ship to the Lupasha Independent Trading Station, where Doc registered the Selroth's ship as a war prize, so it now belonged to them. They returned afterward and parked the ship in orbit. The Batsha spent the whole time with Tina, examining the ship's nav computer and talking among themselves. When asked what the Batsha were up to, they weren't interested in sharing. They'd been excited at whatever they'd found. After the concert, the Selroth returned to their quarters, while the humans went to the mess hall for cake and ice cream. Terry enjoyed seeing everyone so happy. Dan was moving around like nothing had happened, with his metallic blue artificial feet and hands. The caretaker had fixed him up and given him pin plants as well. The caretaker had said it would give pin plants to anyone who wanted them. Doc and his people were planning on it before they went out on contract in March. Terry thought they were probably working up the nerve to undergo the procedure. Regardless of what they'd said, it was obvious the mercs didn't trust the caretaker. Despite that mistrust, they'd discussed konar for them and discarded the idea. "What do you think would be the reaction if we went out on contract wearing those technological marvels?" "I don't know," Terry said. Sure you do. They'd want to know where we got them. They'd really want to know. That made sense, of course. Technology was power, and nothing like the Konar existed in the galaxy. Nothing the humans had encountered in the current era, anyway. Everywhere he looked, the people of Templemere were happy, or at least content. Maybe it was enough. "We going to the caretaker as planned?" Doc asked him over vanilla ice cream. "You bet," Terry replied. He knew Doc wanted to try to get the caretaker to follow his orders again. It hadn't worked yet, and wouldn't work ever. For whatever reason, it only listened to Terry, Colin, or Katrina. Terry seemed to be the one it listened to first, as well, the leader. "You know it wants to see the newborn Bat-Shah, right?" "Yeah," Doc said. "The moms are fine with it." Terry nodded. He'd seen the ultrasound of Wiki Wiki's baby, done by Dr. Janig. The baby's pectoral fins had fingers. The caretaker had altered the bottlenoses' DNA. Hula was only 4 months pregnant. Too soon for a good ultrasound on a Kilshaw. Terry knew what it would show, the same as the Bat-Shah, maybe even more advanced. As the Christmas celebration was breaking up, Terry found a minute alone with just his mom and Doc. "I wanted to tell you something," he said to his mother. She looked at him expectantly. "I'm going with Doc in last call on contract." Her mouth dropped open. "Colin and Katrina are going too. They're telling their parents right now." "You can't," she said, looking at Doc for support, and to her horror, finding none. "You're only 14 years old." "And I was 13 when I led the assault that killed the Ziktal and Selroth." She teared up and looked away. "It's a different world," Doc said. "I don't like this world," she said, and looked at her son. "Things are too black and white for my liking." They left the mess hall for the walk back to their apartment, the one Doc now shared after he and Terry's mom were married a month ago. It was a quiet walk, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Terry's thoughts were closer to his own person, because if the caretaker had altered the orcas to Kilshaw and the bottlenose dolphins to Bat-Shah, what had they done to him and his friends? Maybe he'd ask the machine. Maybe it might answer. All right, friends, that is the end of Black and White by Mark Wandrey. If you really liked that and enjoy it and you want more of this story, please go to Amazon and grab Blood in the Water, also by Mark Wandrey, which is the follow-up to Black and White. If you enjoyed this, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe and share with your friends. We're going to take a couple weeks break now, and we will be back later in the spring with A Time to Die, also by Mark Wandrey. See you then. Bye!